loud and clear.
From the studios of Radio Sputnik in downtown Washington, D.C., it's loud and clear. We take you inside the news 5 days a week. It's happening, and it's happening now. I'm Brian Becker. In early 2000, uprisings swept across northern Africa and the Middle East, or West Asia. The toppling of the Ben Ali government in Tunisia quickly gave way to mass protests in Egypt that brought about the ouster of U.S.-backed Hosni Mubarak government after 30 years in power. But the Arab Spring soon turned to winter as NATO intervened in Libya to topple the Muammar Gaddafi government, and the U.S., Western, and Gulf states armed rebels in Syria. Now, more than 5 years later, where is the Arab world heading? Author Vijay Prashad has written extensively on this topic and recently released his new book entitled The Death of the Nation and the Future of the Arab Revolution. We are fortunate to be joined for the full hour by Vijay Prashad. In addition to being an author of 17 books, he is the George and Martha Kellner Chair in South Asian History and Professor of International Studies at Trinity College. Welcome back, Vijay.
Thanks a lot, Brian.
Let's just start right off with your book. What motivated you? What's your main point? What's the central theme?
It's a good question about motivation. You know, I've been a journalist for a very long time, and over the course of the last 15 years, I've covered the wars in the Middle East and all the way out to Afghanistan. And over the years, you know, I've written about the nature of the war, the kind of technologies used in the war, and certainly in the social impact that these wars have had. You know, so Iraq was, in a sense, the war to really watch, because here one saw massive use of military hardware, and we saw the destruction of a country. It was quite a dramatic end to a state, whatever its own problems, but a dramatic end to a state's dynamic, 150-year dynamic. So a few years ago, when I was in the middle of covering the conflict in Syria, it occurred to me that there's a kind of grammar, you know, that's evolved over the course of this 15-year period. And around this grammar is a core concept, which is the concept of regime change. And in a way, a more practical way to understand this is the destruction of countries. So what I was interested in was to take a step back. You know, when you're writing stories, 1,100-word stories, it's hard to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. So I wanted to take that step back and confront the histories that have led to this philosophy of regime change. In particular, I was interested in the long history of Western involvement in West Asia and North Africa, here to, in a sense, put, you know, secular nationalism and the left in its place. In other words, to make it subordinate to the principal Western allies, which have long been the monarchies of the region, and, you know, in more recent years, the kind of neoliberal elements of the Gulf. So this is a story of the long history of Western involvement in the region, and more specifically, the theory of regime change, which came about after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Vijay Prashad, I want to ask you, let's stay on Iraq and the issue of regime change, because there was the 1958 revolution, the July Revolution, which shook up the entire Middle East, and it certainly shook up the United States and Britain. That revolution was led by the Communist Party and nationalist left forces within the Iraqi military. The Baathists played a minor or almost no role in it, perhaps some role, I'm not sure. But the United States, Eisenhower sent 10,000 troops to Lebanon. The British sent troops to Kuwait. In other words, they were defending their other assets in the region from the spread of the Iraqi Revolution. Then there was a coup in 1963, and the historic leader of the Iraqi Revolution was ousted. The communists took many, many casualties. There was another coup in 68. In 79, Saddam consolidated his power, his authority, and the Baathists purged almost all of their opponents. I mean, when you look at it, the regime change has actually been going on even before the collapse of the Soviet Union, although it certainly has accelerated, because the United States and the CIA had a hand in all of that. Their goal really was to destroy whoever was the most important force on the left, whether it was the communist or communist-aligned movement. Talk about that, if you would.
Yeah, this is an important point you've made, and it'll allow me to clarify what I mean by regime change. Certainly, over the course of the last 50 years of the 20th century, so you're right, from 1958, when Qasim comes to power in Iraq, backed fully by the Communist Party. I mean, there would have been no successful coup in 1958 if the very substantial Communist Party, the largest Communist Party in West Asia, hadn't put all its eggs into the basket of the few military officers that decided to conduct that coup. It was a very, shallow coup made deep by the influence of the left. So you're right that in 1958 this coup occurs, and for the first 50 or so years, there was a deep contest between the various forces in the region. And if I could just divide the forces, on the one side, you have the forces of secular nationalism, and in that camp, you could include the communists, even though there was great tension between, say, Gamal Abdel Nasser and the Communist Party of Egypt. But nonetheless, at one level, they were in one camp. In the other camp was the monarchies, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the various Gulf Arab Emirates, and linked to them was the West, principally the United States, but also the British and the French. These two had almost an even contest for that 50-year period. The United States could get its way, Britain could get its way, mainly through coup d'etats. They were not able at this time, or they were not, it was not possible for them to enter full-scale land invasions. Even the entry into Lebanon was a kind of police action compared to what one sees later. One of the reasons they couldn't come in with all guns blaring was because there were two major blocks to them. On the one side, there was the block of this secular nationalist camp, this kind of third world project bloc that was a substantial impediment to the interests of the Gulf Arabs and to the West. So this impediment should be taken quite seriously, even when there were coups d'etats, as there was in Iran in 1953. This was a contested coup d'etat, and indeed, then there's an Iranian revolution in 1978, where that other bloc forces itself forward. Sadly, of course, that other bloc by now includes sections that are not a secular nationalist, but we could talk about that later. So the second bulwark against a regime change of the contemporary kind was, of course, the Soviet Union. And the Soviets played an important role, whether it was through the United Nations or with their own kind of web of alliances in the region that prevented a full-scale destruction of a country. When the Soviet Union collapses, when the third world debt crisis strikes, the countries of the global south in the 1980s, both these things happen simultaneously. When these things happen, you have now an opening. And it is from, in fact, this opening that the test run of regime change takes place. And this was in Panama in 1989, where the United States used incredible, overwhelming aerial force against Panama, sent in special forces to grab the leader of Panama. However despicable Manuel Noriega was, this is a new mode of dealing with somebody. And they grab him, bring him to Florida, and throw him in prison. Panama was the test case for this kind of massive scale regime change, destruction of institutions, attempt to create a country in your own image. And the one that follows Panama, of course, is Iraq 1991. It's really interesting, Brian, because in 1991, when the United States was conducting a massive barrage of Iraq, inside Saddam's presidential palace, he's sitting there with his culture minister Hamdan, and they are asking each other, where are the Soviets? Where are the Russians? Why aren't they doing anything? It's a very interesting moment because I think they recognized that those bulwarks had gone and now Western power was pretty much unrestrained. So when I mean regime change, what I mean is this massive use of force against a country to overthrow a leader. And in a sense, it's not enough to just overthrow a leader. It's not enough to conduct a CIA coup, but to destroy the state's institutions, to actually create tabula rasa so that you can then make, your own country in that place. And, Iraq is a terrific example of this Because when the Americans come in 2003, they actually believe that they've created tabula rasa and they can now create some sort of neoliberal paradise in Iraq where there's, no regulations, where oil flows freely, etc. So this is what I mean by regime change. It's a very specific kind of destroying countries in order that you, out of a sort of fantasy, can create it in your own image.
That's Vijay Prashad. He is the author of 17 books. His most recent book is The Death of the Nation and the Future of the Arab Revolution, looking back at the Arab Spring and further back to look at the broad trajectories of politics in the Middle East and the struggle by the peoples of the Middle East, or what he calls West Asia. And I want you, Vijay, for our audience to explain it because, of course, Middle East is the popular vernacular. But we're talking about how the evolution of regime change, in fact, has changed, that imperialism was always involved in coup d'etats, at wars against whatever was the more revolutionary or radical faction or party in the Middle East, in this geostrategically important and resource-rich part of the world. And Vijay, you're talking about Panama as being like the new model. And it's so interesting that you mentioned that. And I want to also just completely agree with you because at the time, right after the Panama invasion, I met with Ramsey Clark along with some of my other comrades, and we said, because Ramsey Clark had gone to Panama and had exposed the massive violation of human rights and the large number of civilian casualties, that Clark had said there was a curtain of silence about U.S. atrocities in Panama from the media. And we said, well, let's break that curtain of silence. Let's rip it down by creating a public commission of inquiry to tell the truth. And we did that, and we were in Ramsey Clark's office after the December 1989 Panama invasion for several months. And then in August of 1990, the U.S. begins dispatching what turned out to be 400,000 to 500,000 troops to Iraq, supposedly to stop the toppling of the Kuwaiti monarchy by Saddam's forces. But obviously, they didn't want a negotiated settlement. They wanted to go to war. They wanted to because they could have had a negotiated settlement. So you're right. There was this kind of seamless sort of evolution of American policy with direct, major, massive intervention. And what was happening then was not the Soviet Union still existed, but the Gorbachev government had been weakened and was signaling the West that the historic confrontation whereby the Soviet Union would be the historic partner, at least, of the anti-colonial or struggles for national liberation in third world or emerging countries, that was over. And that became the cue or the signal, the catalyst for this big expansion and change in U.S. policy. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I entirely agree with you. In fact, see, Brian, if you remember, after 9/11, Donald Rumsfeld, then Defense Secretary, made some notes during a meeting. And the notes he made were, he said, take care of Iraq. But there was a phrase in his notes that has stayed with me. He wrote, sweep it all up. Sweep it all up. What is he referring to? You see, for the 10 years before 9/11, that is to say, from the time of the buildup of the first Iraq war, during that decade, the U.S. foreign policy establishment had come to an understanding. They had produced new concepts. You see, because, as you say, the Soviet Union was weakened and right at the threshold of collapse, at this period, U.S. policymakers created a term, a concept called rogue states. And with the concept rogue states, they filled it with countries that they felt were recalcitrant, countries that were not willing to abide by the new, say, free trade protocols, countries that were not willing to abide by U.S. power, countries that essentially wouldn't sign bilateral trade agreements or wouldn't have these kind of military agreements with the United States, these strategic agreements. And these states, or the list of these states, are lengthened during the 1990s. North Korea was always on it. For a long while, Iran bounced on and off it. Then there was, of course, Iraq. Syria came on and off it, etc. Libya was another one. So there was this concept of rogue state. Secondly, there was the concept of liberal interventionism. The idea was that now that the barriers to the use of Western power had gone, Western power should be utilized to sweep it all up, to get rid of rogue states in the name of human rights. They militarized human rights. They made human rights into essentially part of their military establishment. And the culmination of this certainly was not going to be in the Congo. And we can talk about, how certain conflicts don't trigger anxiety about civilian deaths and responsibility to protect, etc. But others did. And the culmination of this rogue state discussion, the culmination of this idea that human rights can be used in a military way to sweep it all up, to get rid of recalcitrant states. The culmination was, of course, the destruction of Yugoslavia and the bombing of Yugoslavia by NATO in 1999. It's an interesting thing that if you start with Panama 1989, it's a direct line through Iraq to Yugoslavia and then to Afghanistan and beyond. There was never a let up. People who believe that this current phase begins in 2001 don't understand the antecedents in the 1990s, this concept of the rogue state, the idea of liberal humanitarianism or human rights wars, etc. This was the kind of field of thought that came out of the State Department and its intellectuals and had a great deal of global purchase, so that, whether it's the Canadian intellectual Michael Ignatieff or whether it's people in Europe, including so-called progressive intellectuals in Europe, this idea of human rights wars became a kind of consensus idea, so that it was, when you say to bring the truth out from Panama, you must realize that it was not just Panama. Every single human rights war after that, it became hard to talk about, the scale of destruction, the nature of the war. And as I said, the culmination is Yugoslavia, because till today, it's very hard to talk about the conflict in Yugoslavia without being essentially thrown into a box as a defender of Milosevic. And I think this is a pity, because there's a great deal to talk about in this idea of the rogue state or human rights wars, because this is the immediate ancestor of the global war on terror.
That's the voice of Vijay Prashad. He is an author. He is a professor. We're talking about his latest book, The Death of the Nation and the Future of the Arab Revolution. You are listening to Loud and Clear. We'll be back.
Loud and Clear. Loud and Clear.
You are listening to Loud and Clear. I'm Brian Becker. We're spending the full hour with author and journalist and professor Vijay Prashad. In addition to being the author of 17 books, he is the George and Martha Kellner Chair in South Asian History and Professor of International Studies at Trinity College. We're talking about his most recent book, The Death of the Nation and the Future of the Arab Revolution. Vijay, before we went to break, we were talking about the evolution of U.S. policy at the time of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the implosion which took place in the early 90s, but the socialist bloc was basically coming apart starting in 1988. You had the invasion of Panama, December 1989, then the war against Iraq a year later. You were talking about Yugoslavia, and of course the U.S., NATO, led by the United States, dropped 28,000 bombs and missiles on Serbia and Kosovo and basically broke up the last remaining socialist government in Eastern or Central Europe. And that was in 1999. And that was, of course, just a couple of years before the Afghan invasion in 2001, and then followed by the 2003 invasion of Iraq. We're going to come back and get back to the substance of your book on what happened in the Arab Spring. What do you mean by the death of the nation? But I want to just stay with this concept that you've been raising, because it was based on power, unchecked power, because the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc was no more. There was no hindrance to the U.S. They were going for it. And yet it was also based on a fantasy, or it seems to me to be based on a fantasy. And the fantasy was that they could, by virtue of intervention, bombing, invasion, occupation, reshape the Middle East and create sort of a passive area in which the U.S. would have an extension of American power through proxy governments. That part does not seem to have succeeded. They succeeded in creating an ocean of human misery and fragmenting important secular governments and countries in the Middle East, but there's no proxy. I mean, in other words, it's not stable.
Yes, and in a sense, it cannot be stable. And let me say, explain that in two different ways. One, there are complicated social worlds in all our countries. And I don't just mean in the Middle East, I mean everywhere. There are complicated histories, divisions, fragmentations. And, human change has to respect these differences and the way in which people negotiate these differences. There's a big difference between a revolution, which takes place from inside a country where different social forces gather together and they fight against an oppressor, and they take time. Revolutions are protracted. They don't happen overnight. And that's one process where there is a kind of integrity of the social history of a country. The other kind of change is, of course, this regime change theory, where there is no appreciation of the complexity of a country. And what often happens is this external massive force comes in, destroys institutions, and then places somebody in power and, in a sense, authorizes one part of the social fragment to dominate the rest. This is one of the things one sees, whether it's in Iraq or elsewhere, this attempt to do social engineering by aerial bombardment. And it's never worked. It's created great distress in these countries. But the second problem that the United States has or the West has with regime change theory is that the general tendency of our times is great misery, inequality, unemployment, underemployment. In other words, there is no economic and social agenda that the so-called managers of the world system have to create justice and peace for the world. So it's one thing to use massive military force to overthrow a government, but the day after, you don't have an answer for people's, economic misery, for their striving for a better world, because that's not exactly what you're interested in. What you're interested in is overthrowing one strong man and putting in place another one. That's not what people are going to get behind. That's merely going to create chaos. So for these kind of reasons, any form of regime change from above conducted by the West, particularly by, with U.S. power behind it, is going to be an utter failure.
That's Vijay Prashad. We're talking about his latest book, The Death of the Nation and the Future of the Arab Revolution. One of the things that President Obama said when he was reflecting back on his now almost 8 years in office, when he was asked what his biggest regrets were, was his biggest mistake was not planning for the, quote, day after, meaning the day after the overthrow or the destruction or, as we know, the killing of Gaddafi. Now, it's an interesting concept because, of course, the U.S. went to the UN Security Council and got Resolution 1973 passed not on the basis of regime change. It was supposedly to protect civilians. But Obama perhaps was a voice of restraint for a moment, for a second, amongst those within his administration who were demanding the war against Libya. I happened to chance upon this Washington Times report that came out about a year and a half ago that I had forgotten about, or maybe I never knew about it. But Fox News did a piece on it. But it was based on recordings, and the recordings indicate that Robert Gates, who was then Secretary of Defense, and Michael Mullen, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mullen, they were opposed in the cabinet discussions about bombing NATO. They said, bombing Libya. They said Libya is not a strategic country for the United States. They were worried about it. But on the other side of the table, you had Hillary Clinton, Susan Rice, Samantha Power, demanding that Obama go ahead and start the bombing of Libya on the basis that if the United States did not do it, it wouldn't be in the same position of giving leadership to those who are advocating, as you said, for sort of a liberal humanitarian intervention and be the champions of these struggles in the Middle East. So Obama said yes. He was called the passive president by the Washington Post, a neoconservative newspaper now. He went along, he capitulated. And of course, we have the complete fragmentation of Libya. Gaddafi's dead. But in addition to that, the country is just split apart. It has really three governments, three centers of power. ISIS, which was not there then, is there now. Other forces like ISIS are there. Again, Vijay, it seems like even though there's seemingly omnipotent power to destroy, there's a very shallow, superficial, or maybe not even a desire to rebuild after the destruction caused by imperial interventions.
You see, Libya is the best example of the failure of the philosophy of regime change. And from February of 2011, I've been writing about the danger of anybody supporting a NATO military attack on Libya. I mean, I was surprised, Brian, that at that time, a great many people of the left, people with authentic histories in the left, supported NATO bombing of Libya. Now, the question that should have risen at the time was, is there really a danger of genocide? And what is the evidence of this genocide? And at the time, it was clear that even Ban Ki-moon, UN Secretary General, said that I am following press reports. In other words, they had no good evidence. The United States State Department said that they didn't know what was going on inside Libya. They were taking their lead from Saudi Arabia. And the French had their own interests to go into Libya. So it's correct that there was there was some sections in the Obama administration uninterested. There were others who have, again, this religious belief that the United States is the major force for good in the world. And if anybody is going to operate a responsibility to protect mandate, it has to be the United States. So at no point, it seems, was there a discussion about the day after. In other words, Brian, the lessons of Iraq, if we take Iraq as one of the earlier gold standards of this form of regime change, the lessons of Iraq were not learned at all. And this is President Obama, who made his name saying that Iraq was the bad war, spoke out openly against the Iraq war, and yet had not been able to absorb the lessons sufficiently that he stayed the hand of his cabinet. And again, the reason I want to just underline this is because there's a religious belief that the United States is the leading world power and that it must lead when it comes to military actions whether authorized by the UN or not. So this is an important thing for people to consider. But this idea of the day after is also something that I think people should consider. There is a false understanding that the West or most big powers with huge militaries, that these military forces are concerned about civilians. This goes back to the 1990s when human rights was essentially delivered as a kind of proposition for war making. Groups like Human Rights Watch, etc., became adjutants of the war makers. In fact, recently, Human Rights Watch basically campaigned against the peace agreement in Colombia because they believed that the FARC rebels in the forest should not have any amnesty. By the way, Human Rights Watch and its predecessor didn't say the same things when the South African apartheid regime collapsed. They didn't say that regime should not be allowed to collapse so easily. The generals of the South African military should be made to pay. In other words, they have very double standards when it comes to their role of human rights and war making. So this idea that the West is actually interested in the civilians of Iraq, of Libya, or the civilians of Iraq, or the civilians of Syria, there should be something that people question. It seems to me that human rights or protection of civilians is more part of their theory of regime change than it's actually of interest in the world. And again, a second evidence for this is right after the bombing in Libya, the UN Human Rights Council asked NATO to collaborate or to work with the Human Rights Council on an after-action report on the use of NATO's force authorized by the UN. And NATO basically refused. NATO said at the time that how can you accuse us of human rights violations or war crimes? We are, after all, the West. The West, by definition, cannot produce war crimes. Those war crimes that you want to study, those were the war crimes of Gaddafi. And Peter Olson, who was the lead lawyer for NATO, wrote this down in a letter to the United Nations. And it reveals that their interest in protecting civilians and in human rights is extraordinarily shallow when it comes to real people.
Yeah, the imperialists in the 19th century had to assign no noble cause to their direct interventions. It was just, this is ours, we're going to take it, we're going to take Africa, we're going to take Latin America because we want to, it'll be our century. But in the 20th and 21st century, certainly in the second half of the 20th century, when imperialism was competing with socialism, they had to assign a noble cause for whatever their imperial interventions are. And Vijay, Prashad, I remember, too, that Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International at the beginning of the campaign to demonize Iraq in 1990, prior to the massive bombing of Iraq that took place in January, February 1991, they went along with all of the Pentagon war propaganda about the Iraqis were taking incubators from Kuwaiti babies and letting them die, and all kinds of stories that turned out to be untrue, but they were echoed just like an echo chamber by these human rights organizations. And I also remember, because we talked earlier about Yugoslavia, that when NATO was accused of war crimes for bombing civilian convoys during the Yugoslav war, the NATO spokesperson, who was somebody from Britain, I guess they chose a Brit because they talk better, to be the spokesperson, he said, no, that's not possible. Our pilots are democratic pilots. Meaning the bombs that they dropped were democratic bombs, and they couldn't actually commit, criminal acts with them. Vijay, I want to go back. We have about 3 minutes before we go to a break, but you talk about this kind of regime change as being almost a religion. Now, a lot of wars throughout history have been fought because of religious ideas, religious beliefs. And sometimes it was against the actual interests of the combatants, but they were driven by theological prescriptions that they must war against infidels of one type or another. And I'm talking about Christian wars, Muslim wars, all kinds of wars in the name of religion. Hillary Clinton is running and probably will be the president of the United States. She has been arguing for an expansion of the war in Syria. She's a critic of President Obama for not doing enough, for not being strong enough. And as I mentioned in the case of Libya, she was the principal cheerleader, along with Samantha Power and Susan Rice. Again, and you cited it as almost a religious concept. How dangerous, we're going to go to break in 2 minutes, and then we'll pick the question of Syria up again. But should Clinton be elected, or Trump, how dangerous is it, do you think, that the U.S. will, having failed in its efforts to topple the Assad government so far, and it seems that the Assad government is stronger, not weaker, than it was, say, in 2012 or 2013, how likely is it that the war in Syria, the U.S. role in the war in Syria, will expand?
I think, frankly, Brian, that neither Trump nor Clinton will be able to actually expand the war. And I think the evidence for that came in Istanbul when Secretary of State John Kerry was drinking coffee at the coffee break of an aid meeting, and two aid workers came up to him and they very angrily said, "Why can't the U.S. do more? Why doesn't it attack Assad?" And John Kerry whipped around. He's quite an unflappable man. He's quite a sober person. But he whipped around, and in a very sharp and angry way, he said to them, "What do you want me to do? Do you want me to go to war with Russia?" And I think this is a realization that the sober heads in Washington, D.C. have come to. That is to say, not only people, in the State Department, those kind of intellectuals, but also people in the military. They understand that the Russian entry into Syria has actually changed the dynamic of whatever the United States has been interested in Syria. So in other words, whether Trump or Hillary Clinton win, whoever wins in November, they really won't be able to easily change the dynamic of what is happening in Syria. There might be more bluster, there might be more rhetoric, but I doubt that the policy in its essence is going to change.
Okay, that is the voice of Vijay Prashad. He's written extensively on the topic. We're discussing regime change carried out by the United States in its different stages and phases. He's the author of a new book. He's written 17 books, but his new book is The Death of the Nation and the Future of the Arab Revolution. You are listening to Loud and Clear. We'll be back.
Loud and Clear. Loud and Clear.
You are listening to Loud and Clear. I'm Brian Becker. We're talking with Vijay Prashad. He is a professor at the George and Martha Kellner Chair in the South Asian History at International Studies at Trinity College. He's the author of a new book, The Death of the Nation and the Future of the Arab Revolution. He's written 17 other books. Vijay, we were talking before we went to break about Syria. I want to just first ask you, though, before we get into Syria a little bit more, explain to the audience why you prefer the term West Asia compared to Middle East.
I mean, it's not a question of preference as such, Brian. It's more specific. You know, the Middle East is an older concept. It relates to a sort of Arab Islamic world. You know, these were other ways of describing the area. The reason I like to use the term North Africa more particularly is you might remember during the lead up to the war against NATO war on Libya, there was a great deal of noise made about how the Arab League had voted in favor of some kind of intervention into Libya. At the same time, the African Union, after all, Libya is a member of the African Union and it's a country in the continent of Africa, took a very strong position against intervention. And indeed, the African Union wanted to send a delegation to Tripoli to discuss mediation with Gaddafi, but they were prevented essentially by the French bombing inside Libya, which happened right after UN Resolution 1973. So there are regional blocks that need to be taken seriously. In other words, why should, say, a country that's not in Africa, such as Saudi Arabia or Qatar, have a determinate influence in what's happening in the regional bloc of Africa? After all, I'm of the opinion that the age of unipolarity, Western unipolarity, is over. And I'm of the view that what we should look forward to, what we should hope is going to happen, is that regional entities appear, entities, whether they're in South America or Africa, etc., regional entities appear so that governance of the planet happens regionally and not, in this sort of highly centralized way with the United States as the first among equals. But that's why I like to use these terms, because they speak to the kind of regional governance blocks that I hope will arise in time.
Unipolarity has come to an end, perhaps, meaning the idea that the U.S., after the collapse of the Soviet Union or after its implosion, could become the unipolar dominant power in the world. Certainly, we know from the white paper that was released in the New York Times in 1991 or 1992, I believe, that was probably written by, well, it was one of the authors, at least, was Wolfowitz. There are a few others. But the idea was that the U.S. would use its extreme advantage in military power over all other countries to maintain its edge, and it would not allow any challengers to challenge essentially U.S. hegemony after the collapse of the Soviet Union. That, of course, not only proved to be sort of an ideological or philosophical or strategic doctrine leading to ever more military intervention, which has not strengthened, from my point of view, the United States, but also emerging countries are emerging. Russia came back. Russia was on its knees in the 1990s. It's too big, it's too developed, too powerful to remain on its knees. China, of course, has developed. India, there is South Africa and its potential. There was other kinds of centers of influence and power. China using the Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank. Certainly the BRICS is an attempt to create a counter-hegemonic force. Whether it succeeds or not, who knows? But unipolarity may be finished or diminished or in decline, but the title of your book is The Death of the Nation and the Future of the Arab Revolution. 40 or 50 years ago, there was a pan-Arab movement. There was an Arab revolution. It was dynamic. It was secular. It had, as you said in the beginning, different sectors, some communist, others of a sort of bourgeois nationalist type. But that movement, that pan-Arab movement as it existed, has been eviscerated as a consequence of numerous factors, principal among them the role of the United States and in alliance with Saudi Arabia. Even in a non-unipolar world, can the Arab nation find a way, a path for revival because of the fragmentation has been so great? What's your view on that in terms of the coming sort of near future?
You know, Brian, this is a very, very good question, and I think you posed it extremely well. So, and by the way, indeed, this is the inside message of the title of my book, which is the death of the nation is the death of this pan-Arabist secular nationalism, and yet there is got to be some future for the Arab Revolution. It's impossible, it's improbable for human beings to see their various dream agendas just dissipate and collapse and nothing new emerge. As you said, the Soviet Union collapsed, but that doesn't mean that at some point Russia was not going to return. One could argue that the Chinese collapsed during the 19th century as through the Opium Wars, etc. But of course, the return of China was relatively inevitable, large demographic space, etc. In the same way, incubated inside these Arab countries is a great sense of the potential and possibilities of the Arab people. This is there in literature, it's there in the kind of projects that one sees, and in the ceaseless attempt against all odds to produce a new kind of politics. So I don't see the death of Arab nationalism as being something that suggests that the Arab world is lost to the progressive forces for some time. I think the two main impediments, apart from Western regime change, etc., the two main local impediments to a proper emergence of a kind of new Arab future, the two impediments are, one, the Saudi monarchy and monarchalism in general. Saudi Arabia has produced a world in its image because it has been able to use its petro money, its enormous oil wealth, to smash the Arab nationalist forces. It has used its oil wealth to create an alliance with Morocco, Pakistan, etc., to defend the monarchies against any attempt by others to come to threaten monarchalism. It has been able to actually withstand the entire era of human rights wars. I mean, if any country should have been in the crosshairs of liberal internationalists, it should have been Saudi Arabia. But somehow they built a shield around themselves, continue to execute people by sword and such things, and get very, very mute criticism from the great champions, liberal champions of human rights. So one important impediment is the presence of Saudi Arabia and the role it plays. I mean, just to drive this a little further, Saudi Arabia's problem with Iran is less about the Shia-Sunni issue and more about the fact that Iran has created an Islamic republicanism. In other words, an Islamic non-monarchical form of government. This is a direct challenge to Saudi Arabia because, after all, most of the Arab nationalists were not religious nationalists, they were secular nationalists. So Saudi Arabia poses one very important impediment to the Arab future. The second is the role of Israel. And I think here, of course, the West plays a part, but so too does the Israeli government by itself. Its ability to occupy and crush Palestinian dreams does a dual thing for the Arab people. On the one side, Arab regimes which don't really allow protests domestically are quite happy to allow the Palestinian cause to be the kind of escape valve for people's frustrations. So Israel provides Arab regimes with this kind of facility, that they allow their people to go on the streets and protest against Israel, but they can't protest against their own government. On the other side, the relentless occupation and misery of the Palestinians is a great demoralizer for the Arab nation. There's a constant feeling on the Arab street that if we can't liberate the Palestinians, we are a people of no cause and consequence. We are a people of no value. So I think that these are the two main impediments for the emergence of a new kind of Arab revolution. And of course, just to say again, these two are Saudi Arabia and Israel.
Yeah, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the 19th century talked about Tsarist Russia playing the role in Europe of maintaining and spreading reaction. The way you're talking about the role, I would say, of Saudi Arabia in that region, in the region of West Asia, or the region of the Middle East. And eventually, of course, Tsarist Russia, like all monarchies, its time comes and it's overthrown and big dynamic changes. And even from within that place, a center for revolutionary activism grew that spread all around the world. It might be very possible. Of course, the Reagan administration in the 1980s, after the Iranian Revolution, said there will be no revolution in Saudi Arabia, meaning the U.S. would somehow make sure that there wouldn't be the toppling of the Saudi monarchy. The Saudi monarchy was that crucial to U.S. calculations about control, power, authority in the Middle East. I want to go back to the Arab Spring in our last few minutes, Vijay, because, of course, I can remember vividly myself, because we were in the streets too during the Egyptian Revolution. We were helping to organize protests against the bombing of Libya, the very contradictory nature of the Arab Spring. But in the case of Egypt, the young people who became the catalyst for this struggle in January 2011, after the uprising in Tunisia, they said, we're a movement without leaders. We're a movement of the people. We don't need leadership. That was kind of the mantra. At least it was, that's what was talked about in the Western media. But of course, there have to be leaders, because ultimately protest can't solve the problems of society. There has to be the acquisition of power, and the power has to be used for purpose, for the reorganization of society in all ways, military, political, economic, etc. You've talked a lot in the past about social change and the role of power. Put that into the context of what actually happened in the Arab Spring, if you would.
So, you're right to say that there were a great many contradictions and distinctions, whether it's between Tunisia, Egypt, what happened in Bahrain. Each of these movements cannot all be put together. On the other hand, there are some similarities. There is certainly the issue of the youth, and very large numbers of young people were enthused by, the moment of Tahrir, the moment of Tunisia, etc. But I think it was unfortunate to say that this was just a youth upsurge. There were, of course, very organized forces involved, trade unions, religious organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood. In Bahrain, there were various parties like the kind of almost illegal parties that are dominated by the Shia majority of Bahrain. So, there were different forces, some organized, some disorganized, that were involved there. But it is also true that there was a prejudice in these uprisings against organization or against building, a very firm leadership that tries to direct events. So in Egypt, while there was some kind of organization of the square, what you didn't have was the kind of strategic, trust, or the trust in strategy makers. When the Russian Revolution happened, somebody had to stand up in the middle of a union house and say, comrades, let's go and do this. Let's go and seize the radio station. Let's go and do this. And the people who often did that were people involved in political parties who had studied the nature of power, who had understood, what should happen, what could happen, how to build people's confidence, etc., and not do things that would result in mass casualties to the people and might demoralize the people. In other words, these were people who had studied and understood politics. They had been in organizations. They had watched confidence being built among people. And in a sense, the forces in places like Egypt that could have done this were much too weak, and they lacked confidence. And also, there was, as I said, a prejudice against these groups coming to positions of authority. So what happens is, inside places like Tahrir, the idea of Tahrir, there was an immediate bifurcation between those who were non-Muslim Brotherhood and the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood, unlike the rest, had an understanding of discipline, of strategy, of what to do next. And they may not have been, always good at what they were doing, but they were certainly much more organized. The other major problem, particularly in Tunisia and in Egypt, was, of course, that these were largely urban uprisings. There was very little rural connection, which, of course, meant that the armed forces, the military, had a open advantage, because the military largely recruits from rural areas. So you didn't see people from the military with any sense that the uprisings, these urban uprisings, had anything to do with them. I think that this is a lesson that people in Egypt have learned. So I've talked to people of the Egyptian left, and one of the big lessons they have learned is to now reach out to rural areas, build their movement in rural areas, create organizations which link to different groups, and not, in a sense, allow their movement to be defined by the media, to be defined as sort of internet movements, because that's not what they were, and that's not what they will be. So a great many lessons have been learned, Brian, and that's how history progresses. It's not that, oh, Tahrir didn't happen and therefore there's a big failure. People have learned the lessons, they're moving forward. This, of course, doesn't mean that there's no gloom inside Egypt, but gloom can be surpassed.
Yeah, no, I hear you, and I really appreciate your comments about that. It was such a rich and deep historical experience. Vijay, Prashad, we have 2 minutes left. I want to ask you real quickly, let's talk about Palestine. You're an outspoken proponent of the BDS movement, Boycott, Divest, Sanctions movement, being on the advisory board of the U.S. campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. Has Palestinian resistance or the reality there changed at all as a consequence of the Arab Spring? And talk about, in the last little bit, what is the importance of BDS for the Palestinians? What is the importance of international solidarity?
Okay, it's just this, Brian. The BDS movement is not defined to create freedom in Palestine. It's actually to create space for the Palestinians inside Palestine and in the diaspora to create a new politics. You know, the BDS movement came at the same time as the Palestinian prisoners released the prisoners' document, which was a call for a new politics. And really, that's what this movement is about. It's about making space for the prisoners' document to be taken seriously and a new kind of progressive Palestinian vision to emerge. That's not come yet, but it will come. You know, that's how history happens, Brian. Everything doesn't happen at the same time. We have to be patient and we have to be dogged.
Okay, we have been speaking with Vijay Prashad. Vijay, if people want to buy your book, if they want to get your book, we have about 40 seconds left, The Death of the Nation and the Future of the Arab Revolution, or your other books. How do they do it? Just talk about how they can get this book. I really, really want to encourage our listeners to get this book, Vijay Prashad's latest book. He's written 17. Go ahead.
If they're in India, they get it from Leftward Books. That's leftward.com. If they're outside India, they have to get it from the University of California Press, and that's pretty easy to find. It's ucpress.com. So go ahead, find it, and thanks for being so encouraging, Brian.
Okay, that was Vijay Prashad. We are completely out of time. We'll be back tomorrow. Be sure to go to our Facebook page, Loud and Clear with Brian Becker, for daily updates. If you enjoy the show and want your friends to hear it, let us know by liking the page on Facebook. Remember, telling the truth is important, but to make a difference, it has to be loud and clear. We are out of here.
Loud and Clear.